invasion of Ukraine, and this is the famine that Stalin orchestrated in Ukraine in the early 1930s.
This lady just said that Tucker Carlson obviously has Russian contacts, Russian propaganda information, but that Facebook and Twitter, not YouTube as much, have cracked down on fake accounts. That they're now getting better at rooting out fake accounts. They're not getting better. They could always do that.
Ideas that could undermine him or threaten him.
They're just now cleaning up their guilt in promoting Putin.
Only one ideology was allowed. And the Ukrainians, who had made an attempt at the time of the Russian Revolution in 1917 and 18 to create their own state, retained this desire for independence and sovereignty. He perceived them as disloyal, and he feared a Ukrainian revolt or revolution. And at the time of his decision to collectivize agriculture, that meant that the Soviet state took over private property, took over land and horses and tractors and farm implements and nationalized them and made them, gave them over to the state. He was especially afraid of a Ukrainian rebellion against that policy. And indeed, there was such a Ukrainian rebellion, as I write in the book. There were even a few armed rebellions. People had weapons in their barns left over from the revolution, and they shot at Soviet apparatchiks and activists who came to implement the collectivization policy. And at one point, he became very afraid that there would be, even the Ukrainian Communist Party was disloyal, Ukraine was disloyal. And so he changed the policy in Ukraine. He changed a whole series of laws that meant that teams of activists would begin to go from house to house in Ukraine and collect people's food. So this was a famine that was not caused by the weather. It was not caused by drought or insects. It was caused by the confiscation of people's food. So the grain, fruit, vegetables, sometimes farm animals, everything was taken away from people with the idea that would weaken the peasantry and weaken the desire for rebellion.
Was there a cover story for that? Like, oh, we're collecting your food to better distribute it to the people?
Yes, the cover story was that Ukrainians and other peasants, I should say this happened elsewhere in the Soviet Union too. It's just that the numbers are different and more stark in Ukraine. The cover story was that the peasants are refusing to turn over their food to the state. There are food shortages all over the country, which there were at that time because collectivization was so disastrous. And we are going to search and take away the peasants' food and give it to the cities.
Kind of like they mostly gave
leaving none for
poor
the
people
peasants.
the Trump virus.
And that was openly discussed. I mean, that was Soviet propaganda. It was in the media. People knew that this was happening.
So something else that Stalin did, and I think this is very relevant to today, he moved a lot of Russians from Russian cities into Ukraine, replacing some of the peasants. Because among the things Stalin did was a lot of peasants died. Nearly 4 million people died in the famine in Ukraine. But also Stalin was rounding up like cultural, religious, political, and intellectual leaders and imprisoning or exiling them. So can you talk a little bit about this displacement of Ukrainians to prison or exile to Russia and their replacement with Russians from Russian cities?
So yes, after the famine, in the immediate wake of the famine, there was a mass arrest of Ukrainian artists, intellectuals, writers, people who wrote dictionaries. There was a kind of attack on the Ukrainian language, museum curators. Many were arrested and wound up in Soviet prisons and eventually the Gulag. At the same time,
what Trump can't wait to do if you let him take over again.
Russians moved into Ukraine, sometimes in organized programs, and sometimes just because there were opportunities in Ukraine. And so the entire Ukrainian Communist Party was replaced with people who would be more loyal